I want you to imagine for a second that you are an artist. You are standing in front of a massive canvas in a dimly lit studio, and you're trying to paint a horse.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But not just a standard portrait of a horse standing in a nice green field. You are trying to paint a horse in the absolute heat of battle, or maybe right after a really long, exhausting, terrifying run.
So you want the grit. You want that raw reality.
Exactly. You are completely obsessed with capturing one very specific detail, the exact visceral look of the frothy foam on the horse's mouth.
Which is incredibly hard to capture, I'd imagine.
Oh, it is. So you get to work. You try delicate, calculated brush strokes with a tiny, fine-tipped brush. You try smudging the edges with your thumb to give it that chaotic texture.
Right.
You spend hours mixing different, precise shades of white, gray, and yellow on your palette. But every single time you apply it, it just looks wrong.
But it probably looks too intentional, right?
Yeah.
Like forced.
Yes, exactly. It looks artificial. You spend hours, maybe even days, trying to predict exactly how the paint needs to land on the canvas to create this specific, chaotic illusion, and you are failing miserably.
I feel the frustration just hearing about it.
So finally, in a fit of absolute blinding frustration, you grab the dirty, heavy, paint-soaked sponge you've been using to clean your brushes, and you just hurl it at the canvas. You are done. You walk away in absolute disgust.
It's completely giving up.
Just done. But when you turn back around, you realize that where that random, chaotic sponge hit the canvas, it left a completely perfect, hyper-realistic representation of the foam.
Wow.
You couldn't have planned it, you couldn't have predicted it, but the accident gave you the masterpiece.
It is the absolute definition of a serendipitous collision. You abandon the illusion of precision, and reality actually delivers the exact result you were looking for.
And that isn't just a fun little story. That is a historical anecdote about an ancient Greek painter named Apelles. But more importantly, it is the exact blueprint for what we are doing today.
Yeah, because we spend our entire lives acting like the painter before he threw the sponge.
Yes, we try to perfectly map out our careers. We try to construct the perfect, predictable financial portfolio. We try to forecast exactly where geopolitics or the economy will be in 10 years.
We try to control every single brushstroke.
Exactly. But today, we are going to dive into a source text titled Apelles the Painter, or What Do You Do If You Cannot Predict? And we are going to prove why abandoning that illusion of control is actually the only way to survive a world governed by total chaos.
Which is a bold mission.
It really is. We are exploring how to stop pulling our hair out trying to foresee the unforeseeable, and instead learn how to thrive in a world driven by extreme, completely unpredictable events, those massive, unforeseen occurrences known as black swans.
And what's fascinating here is that giving up the illusion of control might actually be the most powerful way to actually gain it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because right out of the gate, we are picking a fight with one of the most famous thinkers of the 20th century.
Right, the philosopher Bertrand Russell.
Yeah, Bertrand Russell. He famously argued that the human demand for certainty is an intellectual vice. He believed that if we don't have hard empirical evidence, we need to train ourselves to withhold judgment entirely.
That we need philosophy to teach us how to be purely rational, objective observers.
And I think, most people listening to this right now would probably nod along and say, yeah, that sounds exactly right. We should be objective. We shouldn't jump to conclusions.
That sounds great on paper.
But the text is completely dismantling that idea today. Why doesn't that philosophical objectivity actually work?
Well, simply because it demands that human beings stop acting like human beings. The entire premise of Russell's philosophy fails precisely because it completely ignores our fundamental biological and psychological nature.
Because we aren't blank slates.
Right. And we are certainly not unfeeling, calculating machines.
Yeah.
When we look at the world, we don't just process raw, neutral data. Think about a very simple example. When you walk through a park, you do not simply see a quote-unquote tree devoid of context. You instantaneously see a pleasant tree that provides nice shade, or you see an ugly dying tree that looks like it's going to fall on a power line.
We attach value to everything almost instantaneously, right?
Exactly. It's a survival mechanism. The values, the biases, the immediate emotional judgments, they're deeply embedded in the very act of perception itself. You can't just strip those small values away without massive, paralyzing effort.
It is literally exhausting to try to be completely neutral and perfectly logical all the time.
It is. And this connects to a much broader historical illusion. Ever since Aristotle, and then heavily reinforced by the Enlightenment, society has sold us this highly flattering idea that we are these deep-thinking, purely reasoning animals.
That we sit down, calculate the odds, and act based on pure logic.
Yeah, but the reality is that we do the exact opposite. We actually narrate backward.
Narrate backward. That is such a sticky concept. Walk me through exactly how that works in our daily lives.
It's the illusion of understanding. We do something, or something random happens to us, and then we invent a perfectly logical story after the fact to make it seem like it was planned all along.
Can you give an example of that?
Think about the stock market. Say the market drops 500 points on a Tuesday. By Tuesday evening, every financial news network has an incredibly articulate expert explaining exactly why it dropped.
Oh, like they'll say it was a minor jobs report or some passing comment from a central banker.
Exactly. But if that exact same jobs report had come out and the market went up 500 points, that very same expert would confidently use the exact same data to explain why investors are feeling bullish.
Because they have to make it make sense.
Yes, we invent the illusion of understanding to give a comforting cover story to our chaotic past actions. We desperately want to feel like we were in control.
Wait, let me challenge this for a second. If I just accept that backward narration is a real thing and that I'm not this perfect, rational being, aren't I just giving myself a free pass to be lazy?
What do you mean?
Like, let's use an analogy from the text. You walk into my office, and my desk is an absolute disaster zone. Papers everywhere, coffee cups, pure chaos. Right now, what I do is sit there and concoct this elaborate, highly logical explanation for why the papers are arranged exactly that way for my unique workflow.
Right, you're narrating backward to make the chaos look like a rational plan.
Yeah. But if I stop doing that and just say, hey, I'm an irrational human, aren't I just a slob? Where is the line between accepting our flawed nature and just making excuses for bad behavior?
That is a phenomenal question. And your desk analogy is actually the perfect way to understand the difference. You are providing a post hoc rationalization to cover up the fact that your organization system failed.
Right.
Admitting that you are messy isn't giving yourself a free pass to be lazy. It is actually the first necessary step to protecting yourself.
Protecting myself how?
Well, if you truly believe your messy desk is a highly functional filing system, you're going to put an incredibly important tax document in the middle of that pile, fully believing you'll know where it is.
And then I will absolutely lose it.
And you will be audited. The danger isn't the mess itself. The danger is the delusion that the mess is an organized system.
Oh, wow. Okay, that clicks. The delusion is the danger.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, why does this matter for you, the person listening right now? It matters because straining to be that ideal, emotionless, perfectly calculating Olympian man is a setup for catastrophic failure.
Especially when we are under strain or stress.
Exactly. The text points out that if philosophy and pure reasoning were really that effective, the self-help section of the local bookstore would actually be incredibly useful in consoling people who are grieving or in deep emotional pain.
But it isn't. When a human being is under immense strain, all that high-minded, perfectly rational philosophy goes right out the window.
We completely forget to philosophize when we are hurting or stressed or panicked.
It's so true. So if we accept that we cannot be these perfect, emotionless, predicting machines, and that we're going to make mistakes, jump to conclusions, and be a little foolish, how do we actually operate in the world?
The fascinating answer the source gives is that we have to learn how to be foolish in the right places. We need to completely restructure how we think about decision-making by dividing our choices into two distinct categories.
Small matters and large matters.
Yes. And the rules for each are completely opposite. Let's start with the small matters. For the small, daily occurrences in your life, the lesson is simple. Be human.
Embrace what the author calls epistemic arrogance, except that you're going to be a bit cocksure and overconfident.
Precisely. Don't be ashamed of having opinions. Don't constantly try to act like Bertrand Russell, withholding judgment on everything until you have peer-reviewed evidence.
So if I am planning a picnic with my family for this coming weekend, I should just go ahead and make a dogmatic, overly confident prediction about whether it will rain.
Demand certainty. Be a complete fool in those small, everyday matters.
So, predict the picnic weather. Got it. But then we get to the large matters, the big, systemic, life-altering issues, and here the advice flips entirely, right?
Completely. We are told we must absolutely, entirely avoid depending on large-scale, harmful predictions.
The text specifically uses the example of government Social Security, doesn't it?
Yes. It says go ahead and forecast the picnic, but absolutely avoid relying on government Social Security forecasts for the year 2040.
Why is the 2040 forecast so toxic compared to the picnic? I mean, they're both just predictions.
This raises an important question about how we fundamentally prioritize our beliefs. In school, we are taught to rank our beliefs based on how plausible they sound.
Right. Does this 20-year economic forecast sound reasonable? Does this demographic projection use complex math that makes logical sense?
But we actually need a completely different hierarchy. We must rank our beliefs not by their plausibility, but by the harm they will cause us if they turn out to be wrong.
The harm. This is such a critical shift in perspective.
Let's apply it to your picnic.
Right. If my picnic rain forecast is wrong, what's the harm? We get a little wet, we pack up the sandwiches, we go home. The harm is practically zero. My overconfidence didn't cost me anything.
Exactly. But if a 30-year government financial forecast about Social Security is wrong, and you have based your entire retirement strategy on the assumption that that money will be there for you, and it isn't.
I am utterly ruined. The harm is massive, unrecoverable devastation.
And this brings us to the professionals who make a living providing these long-term forecasts. Economists, social scientists, political forecasters.
How do they factor in?
When you look at their track record, objectively, specifically their ability to predict massive, rare, highly impactful events, those black swans we mentioned, their predictive success rate is essentially zero.
They did not predict the 2008 financial crisis. They did not predict the rise of the internet. They did not predict major geopolitical revolutions.
No, they didn't.
I have to admit, there is a line in the text characterizing these forecasters that is incredibly blunt. It dismisses economic forecasters and social science predictors as mere entertainers.
It really does put them in the same category as a magician or a comedian.
But is it really fair to be that dismissive of people with PhDs who spend their entire lives studying data? I mean, calling them entertainers feels harsh.
If you were looking at it strictly through the lens of long-term survival, yes, it is entirely fair. Because what they are providing is the illusion of certainty, much like your messy desk analogy.
Ah, I see. They offer a highly articulate, mathematically complex, comforting narrative about what the year 2040 will look like.
But they cannot actually see the future. The variables are too complex. The systems are too chaotic. If you rely on their entertainment to make decisions that carry massive potential harm, like your retirement or your company's 10-year strategy, you are blindly walking into a trap.
So what does this all mean for us? It means we have to completely ignore the quote-unquote experts when it comes to the big systemic stuff. We have to shed the comforting idea of full predictability entirely.
We do.
But if we can't predict, we are left in a very vulnerable spot. If I can't predict what the economy will do or what my industry will look like in 5 years, what do I do?
Well, if we can't predict, we have to prepare. Which brings us all the way back to our frustrated painter, Appels, and the immense power of the positive accident.
The story of Appels is profound because it illustrates the core method of discovery we actually need to adopt in an unpredictable world.
Right. When his deliberate, precise planning failed, his frustrated, chaotic, random actions succeeded.
And this isn't just an art anecdote. The text connects this directly to a highly influential ancient Greek school of medicine.
Yes, known as the empirics.
The empirics. I love this concept. How do they operate differently than normal doctors of their time?
They believed that medical diagnoses and treatments needed to remain incredibly open-minded to allow luck to play a central role. They realized that the human body was simply too complex to perfectly predict from first principles.
So they didn't try to map out every single biological reaction before acting?
No, they relied heavily on observation and accident.
Right. The idea being that a patient suffering from a mysterious ailment might randomly eat some bizarre root or plant, and entirely by accident, that food happens to cure their disease.
And the doctor couldn't have mathematically predicted it beforehand. But once the positive accident happens, the treatment is recorded and can be used to cure thousands of other people.
It is the central engine of actual discovery. And the text links this ancient empiric practice directly to massive breakthroughs in modern medicine, too.
It does. Think about how hypertension medication was being tested in clinical trials.
Well, this is a fascinating example.
The researchers were looking for a very specific predicted outcome regarding blood pressure. But entirely by accident, the patients reported a very unexpected, completely unpredicted side effect.
And that positive accident led directly to the creation of Viagra.
Exactly. Which became one of the most profitable pharmaceutical drugs in human history. No one sat down in a laboratory with a whiteboard and predicted that outcome from a set of logical first principles. It was a massive, serendipitous black swan.
And the overarching lesson for you, the learner listening to this, is that you have to structure your life to maximize the serendipity around you. You have to set yourself up for these positive accidents.
To understand the mechanics of this, we can look at the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins and his famous concept of the blind watchmaker.
Okay, let's break that down.
Dawkins argues convincingly that the natural world, and evolution itself, moves forward without any grand predictive design. It moves through small, incremental, random genetic changes, trial and error over millions of years.
But the author makes a very specific, fascinating tweak to Dawkins' idea that we need to highlight here, right?
Yes. While Dawkins focuses on small, incremental changes in biology, the reality of human progress, our technology, our economics, or culture, is that it actually moves by large, incremental, random changes.
Massive disruptive jump.
Exactly. One day we were riding horses, and a short time later, historically speaking, we have the steam engine, then the internal combustion engine, then the internet.
These are massive black swans.
And the only possible way to catch these positive leaps is through aggressive, relentless trial and error. You cannot predict them. You simply have to try a massive amount of things.
Which sounds incredibly inspiring on a deep dive like this. Just get out there and try a lot of things. But human psychology violently hates this.
Oh, absolutely.
There is a motto mentioned from a deeply successful investor, Mark Spitznagel, that goes, "You need to love to lose." I read that and immediately felt my stomach knot up.
Because nobody loves to lose.
No. Losing means looking stupid. It means losing money. It means failure.
It goes against every biological survival instinct we possess.
Hmm.
We are hardwired to fear failure because historically failure meant starvation or exile from the tribe.
But to thrive in a complex modern world, we have to look at this within a fascinating cultural context.
Yes, in partially observing global systems, the text notes that American culture, well, quite uniquely, tends to aggressively encourage the process of failure, particularly in business.
Right, think about Silicon Valley. A founder can start a tech company, burn through millions of dollars, go completely bankrupt, and instead of being shunned, they are often funded again because they now have quote-unquote experience.
Precisely. Failure is seen as a necessary educational stepping stone. Contrast this impartially with many traditional cultures in Europe and Asia, where failure is often met with profound, lasting social stigma and deep personal embarrassment.
Bankruptcy can be a permanent stain on a family's honor in some places.
It's a powerful observation about how cultural attitudes toward failure directly dictate the rate of positive accidents.
There is a really provocative idea here that America's actual global specialty is taking these small risks and absorbing these millions of small failures on behalf of the rest of the world.
That's the argument.
And that this specific cultural tolerance for small losses explains why this country has such a wildly disproportionate share of global innovations. The messy, chaotic, embarrassing trial and error phase happens here, and then the innovations are perfected and manufactured over there in other cultures once the initial risk has been entirely removed.
If a culture or an individual cannot tolerate looking foolish or taking small financial losses, they absolutely cannot engage in the volume of trial and error necessary to stumble into a massive positive breakthrough.
But let's be deeply honest for a second. Loving to lose is incredibly difficult. Even if you live in a culture that supposedly tolerates it, you and I are still terrified of losing face, losing our savings, losing our stability.
It's human nature.
And because we hate these small losses so much, our hatred actually drives us into incredibly dangerous behavior. We seek out fake stability. We seek out the illusion of a smooth ride.
And this leads to what is arguably the most terrifying financial and life metaphor in the entire text. We spend our lives collecting nickels in front of steamrollers.
Collecting nickels in front of steamrollers? It is a chilling, perfectly accurate image. Let's break down the mechanics of this.
Okay, because people are deeply ashamed of losses, and because they fundamentally hate volatility, they hate their income bouncing up and down, they hate their social status fluctuating, they actively seek out strategies and careers that look perfectly smooth.
They produce very little volatility from Monday to Friday.
Right. They are just picking up steady, small rewards. They are picking up nickels one by one on what appears to be a perfectly flat, safe road.
But there's a massive, crushing steamroller slowly, silently creeping up right behind them.
Exactly. The strategy contains the entirely hidden risk of a massive, catastrophic total loss. You trade the minor discomfort of daily volatility for the absolute guarantee of eventual destruction.
To understand how pervasive this is, we can look at several stark examples from the text. We touched on cultural differences earlier, but look specifically at traditional Japanese corporate culture.
Historically, it is a culture heavily reliant on conformity and stability, ill-adapted to randomness. They struggle to accept that a bad business outcome can simply be the result of unpredictable bad luck.
Instead, it is often viewed as a deep moral or reputational failure.
And this intense hatred of volatility pushes individuals and corporations into these smooth steamroller strategies. And when the inevitable black swan hits a massive economic downturn or a corporate collapse, it blows up so spectacularly and the shame is so absolute that it has occasionally led to deeply tragic outcomes, including high rates of executive suicide.
The pressure to appear perfectly stable and competent all the time is literally lethal, and you don't have to look at global macroeconomics to see this. It shows up in the everyday career paths you and I choose. Let's really map this out.
Okay, let's compare two profiles.
Think about an employee at a massive, seemingly invincible corporation. Let's say IBM, back in the early 1990s.
The IBM job provided the absolute pinnacle of fake stability. It was the ultimate nickel-picking strategy. The employee had a steady, predictable paycheck every 2 weeks, a clear, rigid corporate hierarchy, incredible benefits.
Zero day-to-day volatility in their professional life. They felt entirely safe.
But they were completely insulated from the actual realities of the free market.
And then the massive, unpredicted layoffs hit in the early 90s. The steamroller finally caught up. And what happened to that employee? They didn't just lose a job. They faced a total, terrifying void.
They were suddenly entirely unfit for the modern job market because their highly specific skills were only valuable inside the artificial ecosystem of IBM. They'd never had to adapt.
They had zero resilience. Now, contrast that IBM employee with an independent freelance consultant working in the exact same era.
The consultant is living with constant, terrifying volatility. They wake up every Monday morning basically unemployed. Their earnings bounce wildly from month to month depending on client demand.
It feels infinitely riskier on a Tuesday afternoon than the IBM job.
It does. But there is a Latin phrase that perfectly describes the consultant's reality. Fluctuat nec mergitur. It translates to, it fluctuates, but it doesn't sink.
Because the consultant is exposed to the raw, daily volatility of the market, they are constantly forced to adapt.
Yes, they are constantly updating their skills, networking, and shifting their services to match exactly what the economy demands. Therefore, while their daily life feels bumpy, they face a massively lower risk of actual, total starvation or long-term unemployment.
The volatility is their immune system. The bumps protect them from the explosion. And this concept scales up to everything. Let's look at geopolitics, just imparting a purely observational analysis from the source.
Look at the difference between dictatorships and democracies.
Right. A dictatorship, say Syria or Saudi Arabia, does not appear volatile on the surface. You don't have messy daily political bickering in the press. You don't have governments collapsing and reforming every 6 months. The surface looks perfectly smooth and strictly controlled.
They are picking up political nickels, the illusion of absolute control. But beneath that smooth surface, the pressure is constantly building because there is no mechanism for releasing societal tension.
Therefore, they face a massively larger risk of a total, catastrophic black swan event, the steamroller of a violent revolution or a complete collapse of the state.
Contrast that perfectly smooth dictatorship with a country like Italy. Italy's been in a state of practically continual messy political turmoil since the end of the Second World War.
Governments fall, new coalitions form, there is constant arguing, it looks incredibly chaotic.
But that constant low-level volatility acts as a pressure release valve. Italy is actually profoundly safer from the risk of a total systemic collapse into violent tyranny than the so-called stable dictatorship.
So what does this all mean? It means that our entire societal definition of what is safe is completely backwards. Smooth does not mean safe.
No, smooth actually means vulnerable.
If you don't see any bumps in your career, your investments, or your life, it means the pressure is quietly building up underneath until the whole thing inevitably explodes. Think about conservative bankers.
They think they're safe because their lending operations are dull, routine, and lack daily volatility.
But they are actually just sitting on a massive pile of dynamite, waiting for a single, unpredicted market crash to wipe out their entire institution.
They are fooling themselves. They have willingly traded frequent small harmless bumps for the absolute guarantee of one eventual fatal explosion.
Okay, let's pause here because this is the pivot point of the deep dive.
Mm.
If the middle ground is a trap, if the smooth, medium risk path that everyone tells us to take is actually just a steamroller waiting to flatten us, what is the actual strategy?
Right.
How are you and I supposed to manage our money, our retirement, our careers, and our daily lives without getting blown up by the unexpected?
To survive and thrive in a world of extreme unpredictability, we have to adopt what the author calls the barbell strategy. And this strategy is designed specifically, mechanically, to clip what we call incomputable risk.
The destructive black swans that you cannot foresee? Let's break down the exact math on this because it is extremely specific and completely counterintuitive to everything standard HR departments and financial advisors tell you.
Well, what does a standard financial advisor tell you? They tell you put all your money into a medium risk portfolio, a 60-40 split of stocks and bonds. They tell you to aim for the middle.
But we have to ask a vital structural question. How do you actually know that portfolio is medium risk?
You only know because some tenure-seeking expert, using a model built on past data, told you so. And we have already firmly established that their track record for predicting future crashes is exactly zero.
So when a massive black swan hits, like the 2008 financial crisis, that medium risk 60-40 portfolio doesn't protect you. It gets completely decimated. The middle is an illusion.
Exactly. So the barbell strategy throws out the middle entirely. It says you must build a life and a portfolio that is hyper-conservative on one extreme side and hyper-aggressive on the exact opposite extreme side.
Let's do the numbers.
The suggested split is roughly 85 to 90% on the hyper-conservative side. You take the vast majority of your resources, your life savings, your core capital, and you put it into extremely unassailably safe instruments.
We are talking about things like short-term treasury bills, literally the safest class of instruments you can manage to find on the planet, backed by the full faith and credit of the government.
Yes.
Wait, I have to push back here. If I put 85 to 90% of my money in treasury bills, I am making barely any interest. I might even be losing a little bit to inflation over time. Isn't that a terrible investment strategy?
It is a terrible strategy if your goal is to get rich slowly on a predictable schedule. But your primary goal here isn't yield. Your primary goal is absolute survival.
Okay, survival.
By parking 85% of your wealth in pure safety, your floor is absolutely secure. Your core nest egg literally cannot be touched by a stock market crash, a banking crisis, or a negative black swan. You have successfully reduced your risk of total catastrophic ruin to mathematical zero.
Okay, so I am safe from the steamroller, but I still want to grow. Where does the growth come from?
That is where the other side of the barbell comes in. You take that remaining 10 to 15% and you do not put it in safe blue chip stocks. You put it into extremely wildly speculative bets. You get as hyper-aggressive as you possibly can.
You invest in venture capital style portfolios, highly leveraged options, asymmetric bets.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this creates a mathematical structure known as a convex combination.
Let's explain exactly what that means.
A convex combination means you have completely altered your risk profile. You have entirely insulated yourself from the negative tail, the catastrophic loss. The absolute worst thing that can happen in a market meltdown is that you lose that 15% speculative allocation.
Which hurts, but you have already accepted it and your 85% core is untouched. You survived to play another day.
But because that 15% is invested in highly aggressive, uncapped opportunities, it exposes you positively to massive, unpredictable windfalls. You have structurally exposed yourself to the positive black swan.
You clip the downside and leave the upside infinite. I love translating this beyond just finance because it's a brilliant strategy for your actual life and career.
How so?
Think about your job. Don't take a medium-risk job, a job that pays just okay but could secretly lay you off tomorrow when the economy dips, leaving you with nothing. Build a career barbell. Protect your absolute baseline.
So get a job that is incredibly secure.
Yes, maybe something boring but essential. Or keep your living expenses so low that your basic survival is bulletproof. That is your 85% treasury bill in life. And then, once your floor is safe, use your spare time, your spare energy, that 15% to take wild, speculative shots.
Write that crazy sci-fi screenplay. Start the weird niche business. Code the risky app.
Exactly. You are engaging in massive upside potential without ever risking your ability to pay rent and feed your family. You are clipping the downside risk while leaving your upside completely unlimited.
So we have the barbell built. We are protecting our floor, and we are armed with our 10 to 15% wild shots. But here is the critical question. Where exactly do we aim those shots?
How do we know what a good wild shot looks like? Because taking a wild shot by going to a casino is a terrible idea.
Right, we need to understand the fundamental difference between positive and negative unpredictability. And this brings us to a brilliant quote from the legendary Hollywood screenwriter William Goldman.
Oh, I love this quote. When discussing the movie business and trying to predict which films would become massive blockbusters, he famously shouted, "Nobody knows anything."
Which, if you think about it, sounds incredibly pessimistic for a guy who was wildly, historically successful in that exact industry.
Yeah, if literally nobody knows anything, how did Goldman succeed so massively?
He succeeded precisely because he understood the structure of his industry. He knew the movie business is what we call a positive black swan business.
He accepted that he couldn't predict individual events. He didn't know if his specific script would hit the cultural zeitgeist.
But he also deeply understood that when the unpredictable event did happen, when a movie suddenly, inexplicably turned into a cultural phenomenon, the financial and reputational rewards would be astronomical. He structurally exploited the unpredictability rather than trying to perfectly forecast it.
This is a crucial distinction we need to make for our listeners. We can divide all human undertakings, all industries, into two distinct categories based entirely on how unpredictability affects them. First, you have negative black swan businesses. Tell me about those.
These are domains where the unexpected, the unpredictable event can only hit you hard and hurt you severely. Unpredictability brings absolutely no benefit.
Think about the military or catastrophe insurance. If a completely unpredicted event happens in Homeland Security, it is invariably a disaster. You face only downside risk from the unknown.
Banking and standard lending are the classic economic examples of a negative black swan domain. Think about the mechanics of a simple loan. You lend a business $100,000 at 5% interest.
In the absolute best case scenario, the absolute perfect outcome, you get your $100,000 back plus $5,000 in interest. That's it. That is your hard mathematical ceiling.
But what is your downside? If an unpredictable black swan hits a global pandemic, a market crash, the borrower goes bankrupt, you lose the entire $100,000.
And as the text wryly notes, if the borrower suddenly enjoys massive, completely unpredicted financial success because their product goes viral, they're not going to call you up and offer you an extra $50,000 dividend on your standard loan out of the goodness of their heart.
No, your upside is strictly capped by the contract. Your downside is total ruin. Therefore, you never ever want your 15% wild shots to be aimed at a negative black swan domain.
You want to aim exclusively at positive black swan businesses.
Exactly. Aside from the movie industry, these are domains like book publishing, scientific research, and early-stage venture capital. The defining structural characteristic of these businesses is that you lose small to make big.
You spend a relatively small amount of money to publish a first-time author's book, or you invest a little bit of seed money in a couple of kids building software in a garage.
What is the absolute worst-case scenario? The book doesn't sell a single copy, the startup completely fails, and you lose your small initial investment. Your downside is strictly capped at what you put in.
But if, for completely unexpected, unpredicted reasons, that book becomes the next Harry Potter, or that startup invents the next major global tech platform, your upside is monstrous. It is immensely, infinitely scalable.
But we have to offer a massive critical warning here about how easily human nature can ruin this beautiful positive asymmetry. You must avoid the trap of paying up.
Yes, the $10 million book advance. Unpack how that destroys the strategy.
Let's say a publisher sees an author who has a little bit of hype. The publisher gets caught up in a bidding war and pays $10 million for the rights to the author's next book.
By doing that, they have completely structurally inverted the risk profile.
They have turned a positive black swan business into a negative one. Now, their upside is severely limited. That book practically has to become a global, record-breaking bestseller just for the publisher to break even on the advance.
And their downside is now monstrous. If the book is just a moderate success, the publisher loses millions of dollars.
We saw this exactly during the dot-com bubble, and we see it in tech bubbles today. Investors pay massive, astronomical premiums for hyped-up stories and companies with no revenue. They ruin the asymmetry.
The person who actually benefits from the black swan is the early venture capitalist who invested pennies on the dollar when it was unknown, not the retail investor who buys the stock at the absolute peak after the hype has driven the price to the moon. Now, I have to step in and push back heavily here, because when we talk about taking small losses for the chance of a massive, uncomputable payout, the little skeptical voice in my head, what we might call the middle-brow thinker, is screaming right now.
What is the voice saying?
Isn't this strategy just the exact same thing as buying a bunch of lottery tickets? You're taking a tiny loss every day for the chance of a massive payout. Are you just telling me to go buy scratch-offs?
That is a very common, very dangerous misunderstanding. That analogy is emphatically mathematically wrong. And the reason it is wrong introduces one of the most vital concepts in understanding risk. The ludic fallacy.
The ludic fallacy, the illusion that games of chance in a casino represent actual risk in the real world. Break that down for me.
Why is buying a lottery ticket fundamentally, structurally different from funding a startup or writing a screenplay? There are two massive differences. First, lottery tickets do not have a scalable payoff.
There is a known, hard mathematical upper limit to what they can deliver. You hit the jackpot, you win exactly what is in the pool, and that is it. It is a strictly capped payoff.
But real-life payoffs don't have that cap. A brilliant scientific discovery, a cure for a disease, a new communication technology. These have unlimited, or at least completely unknown, payoff ceilings. They can change the entire world.
Okay, so the upside in real life is bigger. What's the second difference?
The second difference is the nature of the rules. Lottery tickets and casino games operate by known, fixed rules and what we call laboratory-style, well-presented possibilities.
When you play roulette, you know exactly how many slots are on the wheel. You know exactly what the mathematical odds are.
And, with absolute certainty that the system is perfectly designed by the house for you to lose your money over a long enough timeline. Real life does not have these neat, predictable rules. Real life does not have a finite number of slots on the wheel.
We don't know the rules in real life, and we don't know all the possible outcomes. And because we're intentionally positioning ourselves in a positive black swan domain, that extra layer of radical uncertainty cannot hurt us. It can only benefit us. We actively want the unknown unknowns because that is where the massive windfalls live.
Precisely. So we know the mechanics now. We know we want to be in the positive black swan business. We want to expose our 15% speculative energy to these open-ended, asymmetric opportunities.
The next logical, highly practical question is how do we actually do that on a Tuesday afternoon? What are the daily habits, the structural tactics for engineering this kind of serendipity in our own lives?
We are given an incredible, highly actionable toolkit for this. And it starts with a foundational mindset from the great scientist Louis Pasteur, who said, chance favors the prepared.
Pasteur deeply understood that you cannot wake up every morning aggressively looking for one specific, highly particular breakthrough. If you are too narrow-minded, too rigidly focused on a 5-year plan, you completely blind yourself to the positive accidents happening in your periphery.
Instead of predicting, you work incredibly hard to let contingency, pure randomness enter your working life.
There is a great quote from Yogi Berra that perfectly captures the danger of being too focused. He said, "You got to be very careful if you don't know where you're going because you might not get there," which is hilarious, but the underlying philosophy is profoundly true.
Trying to predict precise outcomes makes you completely blind and vulnerable to the massive outcomes you didn't predict. To see how this is applied at the highest levels, we can look at strategic thinking within the Department of Defense.
There are thinkers mentioned in the source, specifically Andy Marshall and Andrew Mays.
Now, the natural bureaucratic impulse of a massive military organization is to devote billions of dollars and all its intellectual resources to predicting the exact location, timing, and nature of the next global conflict.
Right, trying to guess exactly which country will do what on what specific date.
But these thinkers advocate the exact opposite approach. They argue, invest your resources in total preparedness, not in highly specific prediction. Why? Because infinite vigilance is mathematically and practically impossible. You cannot predict every possible threat or tactic an adversary might invent.
But you can build a military or a business or a personal life that is structurally robust, highly adaptable, and prepared to handle any shock, regardless of where it comes from.
Exactly.
So let's translate this high-level strategy down to the practical lifestyle advice for you, the learner, listening right now. How do you invest in preparedness for positive shocks?
The advice is incredibly blunt and enthusiastic. It basically says, put yourself out there aggressively.
If a big publisher or an eccentric art dealer, a movie executive, a wild thinker, or a hotshot banker suggests grabbing a coffee or having a meeting, you cancel whatever mundane plans you had. You cancel everything and you go to that meeting.
It is shocking how few people realize that these massive windows of opportunity do not grow on trees and they do not conform to your personal schedule. You have to actively, aggressively collect what the author calls free non-lottery tickets.
These are situations that cost you very little, maybe an hour of your time, the price of a coffee, the awkwardness of an introduction, but carry an entirely open-ended, massive potential payoff.
And once one of these tickets starts paying off, you don't casually observe it, you aggressively chase it. There is a distinction made about hard work. It says you shouldn't just work hard doing repetitive grunt work. You need to work intensely hard at chasing down these serendipitous opportunities and maximizing your total exposure to them.
And this leads directly to a very specific and perhaps controversial piece of geographic advice. It is argued that living in massive, dense, chaotic big cities is strategically invaluable.
Yes. I love this part because it directly attacks the modern idea of remote work isolation. It explicitly calls out the fantasy that you can just move to a quiet, isolated rural cabin because we live in the quote-unquote age of the internet and expect to have the same opportunities.
It argues that isolated mindset completely tunnels out sources of positive, random uncertainty.
Think about the mechanics of a city. When you live in a dense, chaotic metropolis, you are mathematically multiplying the odds of serendipitous encounters every time you leave your apartment. You massively increase your envelope of serendipity.
You literally bump into people on the street. You overhear a fascinating conversation at a coffee shop. You get dragged by a friend to a bizarre gallery opening you never would have planned on attending.
It notes that high-level diplomats understand this dynamic perfectly. The massive historical breakthroughs in international relations do not usually happen via highly structured, dry correspondence or formal, scheduled telephone conversations.
They happen through casual, off-the-record, chance discussions at cocktail parties.
The environment of a cocktail party is structurally designed to allow for unstructured, unpredicted, highly fluid information flow. It is the absolute perfect breeding ground for a positive accident. You cannot engineer a breakthrough via a bulleted email.
I have to highlight my absolute favorite piece of practical advice from the text, aimed specifically at the introverts and the scientists. It literally commands, go to parties. If you're a scientist, you will chance upon a remark that might spark an entirely new avenue of research.
And then it adds completely deadpan, and if you're autistic, send your associates to these events.
It's humorous, but the underlying point is deadly serious. It underscores the absolute non-negotiable necessity of social friction and exposure to randomness, regardless of your personal temperament or social anxiety. You have to find a structural way to get your sponge thrown at the canvas.
Okay, so we are pumped up. We are adopting the barbell strategy. We are moving to the city. We are going to cocktail parties. We are aggressively collecting our free non-lottery tickets. We are fundamentally ready for serendipity.
But we have to be incredibly careful because there are massive, incredibly powerful institutions actively working against this exact mindset. Institutions that are desperately trying to convince us that they have the future completely safely mapped out.
This brings us to a harsh, necessary critique of experts and central planners, particularly within large governments and massive corporations. We are explicitly advised to beware of highly precise plans generated by governments.
It says we should let governments predict because making complex forecasts makes bureaucrats feel better about themselves and justifies their immense budgets, but we should absolutely not set much store by what they actually conclude. Why are they so structurally blind?
The core issue is a massive misalignment of incentives. The primary driving interest of a career civil servant or a massive government agency is almost always institutional survival and self-perpetuation. It is not necessarily to get to the harsh, unpredictable, absolute truth of a complex event. And this structural bias creates incredibly dangerous side effects for the rest of us.
For instance, it points out that regulators in the banking business suffer from a severe terminal expert problem. Because they rely on past data and smooth models, they frequently end up explicitly condoning incredibly reckless but deeply hidden risk-taking.
They give their official blessing to the steamroller strategy because picking up nickels looks so mathematically smooth on their quarterly spreadsheet today.
And you might logically ask, as the DoD thinkers Andy Marshall and Andy Mays asked, well, if the government is bad at this, couldn't the highly competitive, profit-driven private sector do better at predicting these risks?
And the answer is, alas, no. This exposes what is referred to as the ultimate Achilles heel of capitalism when it comes to managing rare extreme events.
This is a huge point. Why are brilliant, highly paid corporate CEOs so uniquely terrible at handling black swans?
Because of a structural flaw called the timeline of observation. The performance of a corporate executive is simply not observable on a short-term basis when it comes to long-term, deeply hidden risks. Let's walk through a highly realistic hypothetical.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a CEO, let's call him Bob. Bob decides to adopt a strategy that hides explosive existential risks deep in the company's portfolio, like the conservative banker we discussed who is quietly sitting on dynamite.
Because the risk is hidden in the tails of the distribution, Bob will show fantastic, incredibly steady, highly profitable returns this quarter and next quarter and for the next 3 years.
And Bob's board of directors will look at those smooth profits, declare him a genius, and hand him massive multi-million-dollar yearly bonuses based purely on that short-term illusion.
And when the black swan finally hits in year 5 and the massive hidden risk blows up and bankrupts the entire corporation, Bob does not have to give those millions of dollars in bonuses back.
He keeps the money, and the shareholders take the catastrophic loss. The tragic systemic flaw is that if you force corporations to compete relentlessly on short-term quarterly metrics, the corporation that artificially appears to be the most fit for survival is very often the one that is taking the most hidden, catastrophic risk. They are structurally incentivized to expose themselves to the negative black swan.
So we absolutely cannot trust the long-term government forecasters, and we cannot trust the highly paid corporate executives because their entire bonus structure depends on them actively hiding systemic risks. So what do we do when we are cornered by these forecasters at a dinner party or in a board meeting?
We go back to the wisdom of Yogi Berra. There are some people who, if they don't already know, you can't tell them.
The advice here is incredibly liberating. It literally advises us not to waste a single second of our time trying to logically debate or fight forecasters, stock analysts, macroeconomists, and social scientists.
It says it is entirely ineffective to moan about the reality of unpredictability to them, because these people will continue to predict foolishly as long as they're getting a paycheck to do so. It refers to them as institutionalized frauds.
The only acceptable reason to interact with them, it suggests, is to play practical jokes on them. Here's where it gets really interesting. It provides a very specific, highly amusing instruction. It says, if you ever hear a prominent economist using the word equilibrium or referring to a normal distribution, which are the mathematical cornerstones of predicting smooth, calculable risks, you should not engage them in a peer-reviewed debate.
You should simply ignore them. Or you should try to put a live rat down their shirt.
Put a rat down their shirt. I mean, it is so aggressive. But why?
It is a highly vivid, aggressive way of pointing out that their precise bell curve models are not just slightly inaccurate. They are fundamentally dangerously absurd in the face of real-world extreme unpredictability. Let's pause and define what a normal distribution is and why it fails so spectacularly.
A normal distribution is the classic bell curve. It assumes that most events cluster tightly around the average, and extreme deviations are so mathematically rare that you can safely ignore them.
This works perfectly for things like human height. You will never meet a human being who is 3 miles tall. The bell curve bounds the extremes.
But the economy is not human height.
Exactly. Social phenomena, wealth distribution, market crashes, book sales, these do not follow a bell curve. These exist in a realm that is referred to as extremistan, where one single extreme event, one black swan, can completely dominate and rewrite the total average.
The economists who use normal distributions are using a map of a calm lake to try and navigate a Category 5 hurricane. Their tools are fundamentally broken, and therefore they deserve to be treated with mockery rather than serious intellectual deference.
So we are completely ignoring the economists with their broken bell curves. We are actively dodging the steamrollers, and we are heavily embracing our 15% wild shots.
But if we throw out all the expert planners, all the comforting normal distributions, and all the precise probability models, what is our foundation? What is the absolute core rule we use to make decisions when we don't know the odds?
We distill everything down to one incredibly powerful central concept, the great asymmetry. The rule is simple, but profound. You must relentlessly put yourself in situations where the favorable consequences are vastly, disproportionately larger than the unfavorable consequences.
The philosophy is stated so clearly in the text. I will never get to know the unknown since, by definition, it is exactly that unknown. However, I can always guess how an event might violently affect me, and I should base my entire decision-making process around that consequence.
To explain this deeply, we have to look at a famous philosophical framework known as Pascal's wager. This was devised by the brilliant 17th century mathematician Blaise Pascal. Pascal essentially argued that he could not mathematically prove or know if God existed. The probability was uncomputable.
But, he reasoned, look at the consequences.
Right. If he acts as an atheist and God does exist, the downside consequence is eternal damnation, infinite, unimaginable loss. If he chooses to believe in God and God doesn't exist, he hasn't really lost much, maybe some Sunday mornings.
Therefore, focusing entirely on the asymmetry of the consequences, belief in God is the only mathematically rational choice. Now, we have to immediately point out the massive theological flaw in Pascal's reasoning here. It quotes Bertrand Russell again, who apparently joked that God would have to have intentionally created fools for Pascal's argument to actually work.
Because the wager assumes a very naive, easily tricked God who wouldn't instantly see through this highly calculated, self-serving fake belief.
Exactly. Theologically, the wager might be entirely bankrupt. But as a secular decision-making framework under conditions of total uncertainty, it is absolutely brilliant. It stands the entire traditional notion of knowledge completely on its head.
This is the absolute crux of everything we are talking about today. Pascal's wager fundamentally eliminates the paralyzing need for us to understand the probability of a rare event. We do not need to know the mathematical odds of a stock market crash, or the exact odds of a massive technological breakthrough, or the odds of a global pandemic.
Because, as we have painstakingly established, those specific probabilities are fundamentally uncomputable. They are a mirage. We cannot know them.
Exactly. So instead of agonizing over unknowable probabilities, we shift our entire intellectual focus to the consequences and the payoffs if the event actually takes place. This is the secret to navigating chaos. The rarer the event, the fuzzier and more useless the probability calculation becomes. But the consequences of that event usually remain starkly, entirely clear.
Let's use a visceral example. Earthquakes. I live on the West Coast. I have absolutely no idea what the exact mathematical odds are of a massive 9.0 magnitude earthquake hitting San Francisco next Tuesday. No one does, no matter what their fancy geological computer model says.
But you can very, very easily calculate the consequences.
Yes. I know exactly what the physical destruction will look like. I know how it will cripple the infrastructure, and I know exactly how it would violently affect me and my family if our house isn't retrofitted.
And that is the central operating system for surviving uncertainty. To make a rational decision, you focus intensely on mitigating the consequences, which you can know and control, rather than obsessing over the probability, which you absolutely cannot know.
It simplifies the chaos of life so much. You can build an entire robust theory of decision-making on this one concept. All you have to do is aggressively mitigate the consequences of the negative black swans. If your retirement portfolio is heavily exposed to a market crash, don't waste hours watching financial news trying to predict if the crash will happen in October or November. That's a fool's errand. You simply buy insurance, or you move your core survival money into the 85% safe zone of the barbell strategy. You fix the consequence.
And then on the flip side, you actively expose yourself to the massive positive consequences. This brings us to a sweeping realization about how human progress actually happens. When we look at the immense historical success of free markets and technological innovation, it is critical to realize that markets do not succeed because of brilliant, overarching master plans, or because humans are perfectly rational, calculating actors.
They succeed through what is called stochastic tinkering.
Messy, chaotic, relentless trial and error. And this vast tinkering project is carried out by a very specific, very human cast of characters. Wildly overconfident entrepreneurs, highly naive retail investors, greedy investment bankers, and hyper-aggressive venture capitalists.
They are all completely falling for the narrative fallacy. They all deeply, genuinely think they have the future figured out. They all think they are the brilliant ones driving the car of history.
But collectively, through their massive, chaotic, uncoordinated trial and error tinkering, they are unwittingly partaking in a grand evolutionary project that pushes human discovery forward. They absorb millions of painful small losses. They occasionally stumble completely backward into positive accidents, and they generate the massively disruptive black swans that build the modern world.
There is a haunting, brilliant line that sums this up. In the end, we are being driven by history, all the while thinking that we are doing the driving.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, it is vital to summarize the three specific plagues, the three cognitive diseases that constantly try to keep us blind to this reality. First, epistemic arrogance, and our corresponding future blindness. We fundamentally believe we know vastly more than we actually do.
Second, the Platonic notion of categories. This is the incredibly dangerous habit of taking the messy, chaotic, fractal real world and forcing it into neat, perfectly defined academic boxes. We are constantly fooled by experts in disciplines like macroeconomics that sound highly rigorous but do not actually possess any real predictive power.
And finally, the ultimate trap, relying on flawed tools of inference derived from mediocrism. Using highly precise models like the bell curve, which were built for normal, mild environments, and foolishly trying to use them to navigate a world completely dominated by extreme, unpredictable black swans.
Okay, let's pull all of this together because we have covered an immense paradigm-shifting amount of ground today. We started by completely rejecting Bertrand Russell's demand for sterile certainty, accepting instead that we are highly flawed humans who narrate backward to comfort ourselves, not perfectly rational predicting machines. We learned that we should absolutely be fools and demand certainty in small, harmless matters like weekend picnics, but that we must aggressively avoid relying on massive, large-scale predictions from expert entertainers when the harm of being wrong is catastrophic.
We explored the absolute necessity of the positive accident, the Appel strategy of frustrated trial and error, and the unique cultural requirement to love to lose small amounts in order to win massively.
You expose the terrifying hidden risks of picking up daily nickels in front of massive steamrollers. We saw how the illusion of perfect stability, whether in rigid Japanese corporate culture, the false comfort of a 1990s IBM job, or the artificial peace of a geopolitical dictatorship always masks the absolute guarantee of an eventual fatal explosion.
We structurally mapped out the barbell strategy, mathematically protecting 85 to 90% of your downside from ruin, while taking wild, hyper-aggressive, leveraged swings with your remaining 10 to 15%, specifically in domains with massive positive asymmetry.
We learned to aggressively avoid negative black swan traps, where your upside is capped and your downside is infinite, like traditional lending. And we learn to hunt for open-ended positive black swans like publishing, science, or venture capital, while being incredibly careful never to pay massive upfront premiums that ruin the mathematical upside.
We discussed the daily tactics for engineering serendipity, getting out of the isolated cabin and moving to dense cities, attending cocktail parties, and aggressively collecting free non-lottery tickets, all while completely ignoring the smooth, precise, bonus-seeking plans of governments and corporate CEOs.
And finally, we replaced the agonizing, paralyzing need for precise probabilities with the brilliant clarity of Pascal's wager. Focus purely, entirely on mitigating the negative consequences of the unknown, while maximizing your exposure to the massive positive consequences.
Which leaves us with a profound, almost uncomfortable realization about the true nature of human progress.
Exactly. And that brings me to a final thought for you, the learner, to deeply mull over today. We just spent this time uncovering how the free market and human progress in general actually relies on this deeply messy, stochastic tinkering. The engine of innovation literally requires millions of overconfident entrepreneurs and incredibly naive investors who genuinely, delusionally believe they can predict the future. They fall completely for the narrative fallacy, they take massive, uncalculated risks, and collectively, through their millions of failures, they push society forward by accidentally stumbling into positive black swans.
Their individual delusion provides the raw fuel of trial and error for the collective good.
So it leaves you with a really uncomfortable question. We literally need those crazy, overconfident dreamers to fail over and over again so that society as a whole can stumble into the next massive medical or technological breakthrough. But now that you know the secret, now that you understand the mechanics of unpredictability and you know how to build a barbell strategy to protect your downside, you have a stark choice to make. Does humanity actually need people to remain completely blind to the black swan in order to keep the grand engine of discovery running? And more importantly, what role are you going to play? Are you going to be the visionary, delusionally throwing yourself at the wall and risking total ruin for a breakthrough? Or are you going to build your barbell, safely sweep up the pieces of their failures, and wait patiently to capitalize on the positive accidents?
It is a stark binary choice between individual safety and the chaotic fuel of collective progress.
Think about that the next time you find yourself getting incredibly frustrated trying to paint the perfect picture or plan the perfect career. Sometimes the absolute best, most profitable thing you can do is just throw the sponge at the canvas and see what happens. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take a hard look at your own life this week and ask yourself honestly, where are you quietly picking up nickels in front of a steamroller? We'll see you next time.